Most people who encounter a baboon for the first time make a mistake. They see a medium-sized primate, a little ragged around the edges, rummaging through a garbage bin, or sitting on a road, and in some comparisons exceeding even the great apes per unit of body weight. The female baboon is substantially smaller than the male, typically half the male's body weight, which gives the baboon one of the highest degrees of sexual dimorphism in any primate species. This dimorphism is itself informative about the evolutionary. Primates is generally associated with intense male-male competition for access to females, with the largest males in each generation outcompeting smaller ones, and thereby biasing the gene pool toward larger male body size across evolutionary time. The baboon's dimorphism is a record written in bodies of how much male-male competition has mattered in this lineage, and how consistently it has produced outcomes in which size and fighting capacity were the primary determinants of competitive success. The baboon brain, relative to body size, is among the largest of any non-human primate outside the great apes, and the cognitive demands of baboon social life are thought to be one of the primary evolutionary drivers of that relative brain size. The social group hypothesis for primate brain evolution, which proposes that the computational demands of tracking social relationships in large, complex groups drove the expansion of primate brains over evolutionary time, finds some of its strongest support in baboon data. A baboon troop can contain over 100 individuals. Each adult individual in that troop has a network of relationships with every other adult, relationships that have their own history, their own valence, and their own implications for how any given interaction will play out. Tracking this network accurately, predicting how third parties will respond to observed interactions between other animals, and calibrating one's own behavior based on this continuously updated social map requires a cognitive system of substantial power. The baboon's brain prevalent accumulated knowledge. The troop benefits from the experience of its most experienced members in the same way that elephant herds benefit from their matriarchs, and the loss of the most experienced animals to predation or old age is a genuine cost to the group's collective foraging efficiency. The vocal repertoire of the baboon is one of the most extensively studied in the primate literature, and one that has contributed more than almost any other animal communication system to the scientific understanding of what animal calls actually encode and how other animals decode them. The work of Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seafarth, conducted over decades at the Moremi Game Reserve in Botswana and at other sites, documented that baboon calls carry information about the caller's identity, the caller's social relationships, the caller's emotional state, and the nature of the social event that prompted the call. A female baboon hearing a recording of a call produced by a rival female directed the production of specific signals that carry information about the category of threat and that trigger specific behavioral responses, rather than simply producing a generalized alarm reaction. The baboon vocabulary, if we can use that word carefully, contains at minimum a category for aerial predators and a category for terrestrial predators, and probably contains more specificity than that within those categories. The baboon's relationship with other species in its ecosystem is not limited to predator avoidance. Baboons associate regularly with impala and other ungulates in ways that appear to be mutually beneficial. The ungulates benefit from the baboon's alarm calls and elevated vantage points, and the baboons benefit from the ungulate's acute sense of smell and ground-level predator detection. This heterospecific association is documented across multiple sites and reflects a level of interspecies social awareness that requires the baboon to model the behavioral states of animals that are not its own species, tracking what the impala is doing and responding to changes in impala behavior as relevant information about the shared environment. The baboon that uses an impala's posture and attention direction as a supplement to its own sensory information is deploying a form of social cognition that extends beyond the boundaries of its own species. This is not simple learning. It is the flexible application of a social intelligence that was built for tracking conspecifics, but that turns out to work on other species too. The olive baboon's tool use is limited compared to what chimpanzees or capuchin monkeys demonstrate, but it is real in specific contexts. Baboons have been observed using stones to crack open hard-shelled fruits, using sticks to probe for invertebrates in narrow spaces, and carrying objects over distances in ways that suggest some anticipatory planning. The tool use is not as systematic or as culturally transmitted as what chimpanzees or capuchins do, but its presence in a lineage that is less closely related to humans than the great apes demonstrates that the capacity for object use as a tool is not restricted to a narrow slice of the primate family tree. It is a latent capacity in primates that is expressed to varying degrees, depending on the ecological pressures that have favored or failed to favor its development. The sleeping site selection that baboons engage in each evening is itself a cognitively demanding task that reflects their assessment of predation risk in real time and their memory of sites that have been safe in the past. Baboons prefer to sleep in large trees that offer both elevation and multiple branches, or on cliff faces where predator access is physically constrained. The selection of the night's sleeping site involves route planning that takes into account the day's ranging position, the available sleeping sites within traveling distance, and the recent predator activity in the area. Groups that have been disturbed at a sleeping site by a predator on a previous night show altered sleeping site selection in the following days, preferring sites at greater distance from the disturbance location. The baboon is carrying a map not just of the landscape's food and water resources, but of its threat history, and it is using that map to make decisions that have survival consequences. The baboon's response to death within the troop adds a dimension to the picture of its cognitive and emotional life that has received increasing attention in the literature over the past decade. Female baboons whose infants die have been observed carrying the dead infant for days or weeks, maintaining contact with the body in ways that parallel the behavior documented in chimpanzees and in elephants, and that researchers interpret as evidence of a cognitive and emotional relationship with the dead individual that does not immediately resolve when the individual stops being alive. Adult baboons have been observed approaching the bodies of dead group members, investigating them with apparent attention, and in some cases displaying behaviors associated with social interaction before leaving the site. Whether these behaviors reflect anything like what humans experience as grief is a question the science approaches carefully. What they reflect, at minimum, is a relationship between the living animal and the dead one that persists in the living animal's behavior beyond the moment of death, and that is responsive to the identity of the dead individual rather than simply to the presence of a dead conspecific. The baboon's cognitive map of its social world extends to include information about the social relationships of other individuals, not just its own relationships with those individuals. This is called third-party social knowledge, and its presence in baboons was one of the findings that did most to establish that non-human primate social intelligence was genuinely complex in a way that previous research had underestimated. A baboon that overhears an aggressive interaction between two other troop members updates its behavior toward both participants in ways consistent with knowing that the relationship between those animals has changed. It does not just register that something happened. It registers what the social meaning of what happened is and adjusts its own behavior toward both animals accordingly. This capacity for tracking the relationships between third parties and for using that information to navigate one's own social situation more effectively is one of the most demanding cognitive tasks that social life imposes, and the baboon's performance on it is among the strongest documented in any non-human primate. The baboon's capacity for social learning and the specific things it learns and passes on within troops is one of the areas where the long-term study data has produced findings that continue to develop. Troops in different areas have different foraging traditions, different responses to human presence, and different social conventions around resources that reflect local learning rather than genetic difference. The Amboseli Baboon Project, which has been monitoring identified individuals and their behavior continuously since 1971, has accumulated enough data across generations to begin mapping what is transmitted and how, and the answer is the same one that emerges from every long-term primate study. A substantial amount of what animals know about their world is not wired in. It is learned from the social environment in the way that any cultural knowledge is learned, through the observation of others and the gradual incorporation of what is observed into one's own behavioral repertoire, the baboon's culture is less rich and less varied than the chimpanzees, but it is real, and it matters for understanding why baboons in different areas behave differently, even when the ecological conditions they inhabit appear similar. What the baboon is, before you get to the hierarchy and the violence and the specific behaviors that the next 3 parts will examine in detail, is this: one of the most cognitively sophisticated, socially complex, and ecologically successful primates alive. The animal on the verge watching the car go by is doing something with its mind that the car's occupants are almost certainly underestimating. It knows who in its troop is in coalition with whom this week. It knows which of the adult males is currently most likely to challenge the alpha and what the probable outcome would be. It knows the history of every significant social interaction in the troop over the years of its adult life, and it is updating that knowledge continuously from everything it observes. The baboon on the roadside is not bored. It is running a social calculation that it has been running continuously since before it was old enough to participate in the outcomes its calculations are about. The rest of this series is about what those calculations produce and what living inside them costs. The baboon's evolutionary success across millions of years in some of the most challenging and predator-dense environments on Earth has produced a set of physical and behavioral traits that, taken together, constitute one of the most complete adaptive packages in the primate order. The large canines that make the male dangerous to predators and to rival males. The extreme sexual dimorphism that reflects millions of years of male-male competition. The large brain that tracks a 100-individual social network in real time. The diverse diet that allows survival in habitats where specialists would starve. The coalition behavior that allows individuals to punch above their weight in competitive interactions. The alarm call system that provides community-wide threat detection at a level no individual could achieve. The heterospecific associations that extend the troop's sensory coverage into the olfactory and acoustic ranges of other species. Each of these traits is an adaptive response to a specific challenge, and together they constitute a survival package that has made the baboon the most successful primate in Africa, apart from the one writing this sentence. The baboon's social memory is long and specific in ways that matter for how it navigates the hierarchy. Individual animals are recognized across years of separation. Research has documented that baboons who were members of the same troop and then separated when one animal transferred to another troop show different responses when they encounter each other again than they show towards strangers, even after periods of separation that extend over years. The social history between the two individuals, encoded in whatever neural substrate carries social memory in the baboon brain, persists across the separation and influences the interaction when the animals are reunited. This long-term social recognition is not just a cognitive curiosity. It is the foundation on which the complex accounting of social debts and alliances that baboon social life requires can operate. You cannot manage a network of reciprocal obligations that extends over years without remembering who the parties to those obligations are. Enforcement in multi-male baboon troops. It is not about relative position in a hierarchy between individuals of similar status. It is about the absolute control of an individual female's movement and social access by a male who has claimed her. The evolutionary pressures that produce this system in hamadryas and not in other baboon species are still debated, but the system itself is documented thoroughly enough to be confident that it is real, that it is stable across generations, and that it involves a level of direct behavioral control of females by males that exceeds what that most people in sub-Saharan Africa have the most reason to take seriously as a direct presence in their lives. The conflicts between baboon troops and farming communities, which occur across a wide band of rural Africa, wherever baboon habitat overlaps with agricultural land, involve real economic harm to farmers who cannot afford the losses. A baboon troop raiding a maize field can destroy in minutes what a family needs for months. The management of these conflicts, which requires balancing the conservation of a native species with the economic and food security interests of communities that bear the cost of its presence, is one of the most active areas of applied wildlife management. 5 and 8 male baboons emigrate from their birth troop. The departure is not always clean or easy. It can involve a period of ranging on the periphery of the birth troop's range, brief associations with other solitary males or with neighboring troops, and then the gradual incorporation into a new troop that begins when the immigrant male is tolerated at the group's edge, and that extends over months or years as he establishes himself within the new social structure. The immigrant enters the new troop at the bottom of the male hierarchy. Regardless of his mother's rank in the birth troop, regardless of the social capital he may have accumulated in his natal group, regardless of his size or his physical condition, he starts over. Everything he builds from that point is built in the new troop, from the position he starts in, which is the worst position available. Subscribe before we go any further. Drop a comment right now telling us where you are watching from and what time it is there. The ascent from the bottom of the hierarchy is not primarily a story of direct physical confrontation, though physical confrontation is part of it. It is primarily a story of social strategy, the identification of potential allies, the investment in those alliances through grooming and support in competitive interactions, and the gradual construction of a coalition whose combined weight can support challenges to animals ranked higher than any individual challenger could defeat alone. The male who rises fastest is not always the largest or the most aggressive. He is often the one who reads the social landscape most accurately, who identifies the alliances that will be most useful, and who invests in those alliances most consistently. The grooming behavior that male baboons direct at potential allies is not casual social maintenance. It is investment. The time and the energy spent grooming another male is time and energy not spent foraging or resting, and the allocation of that investment reflects the strategic assessment of which relationships are most likely to produce useful returns. In terms, high-value allies receive more grooming, lower-value associates receive less. The tracking of these reciprocal relationships across the social network of a baboon troop and the calibration of grooming investment to the expected future returns from each relationship requires exactly the kind of social accounting that the baboon's large brain was shaped to perform. The coalition challenge is the mechanism by which the grooming investment gets converted into hierarchical mobility. When a dominant male is in consort with an estrus female, the most reproductively valuable situation in baboon social life, he is vulnerable to coalition challenge in a way that he is not vulnerable in ordinary competitive interactions. A single male challenging a consort male is taking on an animal that is typically higher ranking and therefore more likely to win a direct confrontation. Two males challenging together, one distracting the consort male while the other gains proximity to the female, succeed at much higher rates. The male who has invested in alliance building has, at this moment, a resource that the alliance building purchased, a partner willing to take the risk of the challenge because the expectation of reciprocation makes the risk worth taking. The canine teeth that make the adult male baboon physically formidable are not incidental to this story. They are central to it. The threat display that a dominant male directs at a rival or a subordinate, the yawn that exposes the full length of the canines in a slow, deliberate display, is not idle communication. It is a demonstration of a capability that the animal displaying it has used in serious fights, and that the animal receiving it has every reason to take seriously. The largest canines in a troop's male hierarchy belong to animals who have used them in the service of the same competition that the grooming and the coalition building serve. The physical and the social dimensions of baboon male competition are not separate systems. They are integrated aspects of a single competitive strategy in which the threat of physical harm and the reality of social leverage reinforce each other continuously. The fights that occur when coalition challenges fail, or when dominance contests escalate past the point where displays and threat yawns can resolve them, are serious in ways that are sometimes lethal and often permanently injurious. Adult male baboons have been documented losing fingers, ears, and portions of their faces in combat. The wounds inflicted by canine bites to the face and neck require, in research contexts where injured animals can be assessed, veterinary intervention of the kind that serious bite wounds in any large mammal require. In the wild, animals with serious wounds either recover or they do not, and the rate at which serious wounds contribute to male mortality is a real but difficult to measure component of the overall competitive cost that male baboon life imposes. The males who carry the most scars in a troop are often, paradoxically, the ones who have been most successful in competition, because the scars are the record of fights that they survived and in many cases won. The animal with no scars is either very young or very careful or very subordinate. The immigrant male's first months in a new troop are among the most dangerous of his life. He is at the bottom of an established hierarchy, unknown to the other males, and without the alliance network that would provide support if any established male decided to target him. The established males of the troop respond to his presence with a combination of threat displays, chases, and in some cases direct attacks that test his willingness to submit and his capacity to absorb the punishment of low rank without escalating into challenges that he cannot yet win. The immigrant's behavioral strategy during this period is critical. He must demonstrate enough submissiveness to avoid provoking serious attacks from dominant males, while simultaneously projecting enough capability to attract the attention of potential allies who are looking for a partner with competitive value. Too submissive, and he invites exploitation. Too assertive, and he invites attacks he cannot survive. The navigation of this period requires the social intelligence that the baboon brain is built for, applied to a situation where the error cost is immediate and physical. The females of the troop play a role in male rank that is not always visible in accounts focused on male-male competition, but that long-term research has shown to be real and significant. Females in baboon troops form preferences for specific males based on social compatibility, prior history of association, and the male's behavior toward the female's infants. These female preferences are not entirely irrelevant to male rank outcomes. A male who is preferred by multiple high-ranking females gains a form of social support that can supplement his coalition with other males. Females have been documented intervening in male conflicts, producing alarm calls when a preferred male is being attacked, and grooming males with whom they have established affiliative relationships in ways that reinforce those relationships over time. The male hierarchy is not an entirely male phenomenon. It is embedded in the full social network of the troop, and the female portion of that network has effects on how male competition plays out. The specific mechanism by which male baboons assess each other's competitive value before committing to a confrontation involves a set of behavioral signals that researchers have studied extensively, because understanding them illuminates how which in baboon communication is a direct competitive challenge is another. The presentation of the hindquarters, which in baboons signals submission, functions as a capitulation signal that can resolve a confrontation before it escalates to contact. The physical posturing that dominant males use, including piloerection that increases apparent size, lateral presentation that displays body width, and the strutting walk that announces confidence in the animal's own competitive position, all carry information about the displayer's assessment of its own capability relative to the recipient. Reading these signals accurately and producing them in the right contexts is a social skill that young male baboons develop across years of practice before their physical maturity gives the signals the competitive weight they will eventually carry. The physiological cost of low rank in male baboons is one of the most thoroughly documented examples in primatology of how social position translates into biological outcomes, and the data is striking in its the competition actually costs at each level of the hierarchy. High-ranking males who are in stable, uncontested dominance positions show lower cortisol levels than low-ranking males as expected, but high-ranking males are a more socially experienced male who has the connections the younger one lacks. The younger male provides the physical capability for confrontations that the older male can no longer win alone. The older male provides the social network, the experience of reading the competitive landscape, and the established relationships with key females and other males that give the coalition its social leverage. This intergenerational alliance type, which researchers have documented at multiple sites, is one of the clearest examples of complementary competencies in non-human primate cooperative behavior and lasts longer. The most successful male baboon is not the most violent. He is the one who manages his violence most strategically across the longest possible competitive lifespan. The baboon male's trajectory from immigrant at the bottom to competitor in the middle to occasional alpha at the top and eventual subordinate in decline is a life structured entirely around a competition he did not choose and cannot exit. The females in the troop, whose social world is the subject of the next part, have a different relationship to the competition that the males run, and a different set of tools for managing it. What they share with the males is the same fundamental situation: a social system that produces benefits for those at the top and costs for those at the bottom, enforced by the continuous behavioral pressure of every interaction of every day, and managed by a cognitive system sophisticated enough to make the management interesting, complex, and, at the highest levels of competitive skill, genuinely impressive to watch. The data on lifetime reproductive success from the Amboseli Baboon project, which has tracked paternity through genetic analysis, in addition to behavioral observation, produced a finding that substantially complicated the simple picture in which alpha males monopolize reproduction. Alpha males do have elevated reproductive success compared to mid-ranking males, and mid-ranking males have elevated success compared to low-ranking males. But the relationship is not as steep as the behavioral priority at estrus females would predict if all matings were controlled by rank. The reason for the discrepancy is the coalition challenge. The consort male who is challenged by a coalition, even a dominant male, loses access to the female during the challenge period, and the challenging males have opportunities for mating that do not show up in the simple accounting of who the alpha male is. The paternity data from Amboseli finds that a significant fraction of offspring are sired by males who are not the highest-ranking male in the troop at the time of conception, and that this fraction reflects the coalition challenge system rather than opportunistic mating in the absence of dominant males. The competition produces more diverse reproductive outcomes than a strict rank-to-access relationship would, and the genetic data demonstrates that the social sophistication of the coalition system is doing real reproductive work for the males who have invested in it. The redirected aggression that dominant males direct at lower-ranking animals following their own stressful encounters with rivals is one of the darker regularities in baboon competitive behavior, and one that links the male hierarchy directly to the welfare of the most vulnerable members of the troop. A male who has just been threatened or challenged by a rival, or who has lost a dominance contest, is more likely in the minutes and hours following that event to direct unprovoked aggression at animals below him in the hierarchy, animals that had nothing to do with the original interaction and that cannot defend themselves against the aggressor. The redirection is not random. It tends to target animals that are substantially lower in rank than the aggressor, providing little risk of retaliation. And it tends to be targeted at animals that the aggressor has social reasons to pick on, such as animals allied with rivals. The physiological mechanism appears to involve the stress response from the original interaction persisting in the form of elevated arousal and reactivity that gets discharged in the form of aggression against the nearest available low-risk target. For low-ranking males and for females and juveniles in proximity to frustrated dominant males, this means that they bear the physiological and behavioral costs of competitive interactions they were not party to. The injuries that baboon males accumulate across competitive careers have been documented in enough detail at long-term field sites to allow some analysis of their consequences. Males with serious injuries, particularly injuries to the limbs or hands that reduce their mobility or their grip strength, show measurable declines in competitive performance following the injury, including drops in dominance rank that are often not recovered. The inverse relationship between injury severity and subsequent rank recovery suggests that physical condition is a real constraint on competitive ability, not just a correlate of age, and that the serious injuries that the most aggressive competitive strategies risk producing can directly undermine the hierarchical position that the aggressive strategy was intended to maintain or improve. The male who fights hardest is not always the one who ends up highest, partly because fighting hardest is the strategy most likely to produce the injuries that limit future competitive performance. The reconciliation behavior that follows aggressive interactions between male baboons, documented in the literature in parallel with the equivalent behavior in chimpanzees, adds nuance to the picture of continuous male competition. After a serious aggressive interaction between two males, particularly between animals with prior affiliative relationships, reconciliation behavior, approach, grooming, and social proximity occurs at rates above what chance association would predict in the period following the conflict. The reconciliation reduces the physiological stress markers of both animals and appears to restore the relationship to a functional state that allows future coalition behavior between the same animals. The reconciliation is not sentimental. It is practical. The male who has just fought with an ally needs that ally's future cooperation, and the reconciliation is the behavioral mechanism by which the working relationship is repaired. Violence and repair are part of the same system, operating in sequence to maintain the social infrastructure that the competition requires. The specific baboon that sits at the top of the hierarchy at any given moment is not there by accident and is not there permanently. He is there because of the specific accumulation of competitive investments, alliance relationships, and fortunate timing that his social career has produced, and he will remain there only as long as those investments continue to return value, and the animals below him do not assemble a coalition that can displace him. The alpha position is not a destination. It is a state in a continuous process, and the process has no endpoint other than the male's death or emigration. What the long-term data at sites like Amboseli makes visible, through the accumulated records of hundreds of identified individuals across multiple generations, is not a series of isolated competitive events, but the continuous operation of a social system that is always running, always producing outcomes, and always costing something to everyone inside it, at whatever level of the hierarchy they occupy. The baboon male standing at the edge of the troop in the late afternoon, watching the savannah, is running a version of the same calculation he has been running since he entered this troop years ago. Who is above him? Who is below him? Who is his ally this week, and whether that alliance is likely to hold? Which of the animals above him is most vulnerable to challenge given the current coalition landscape? Whether the reproductive opportunity represented by the estrus female in the center of the troop is worth the risk of challenging the consort male who holds it, given who is available as a coalition partner, and whether the expected payoff justifies the expected cost. The calculation is not conscious in the way that human strategic planning is conscious, but it is real and it is running. And it is producing behavioral outputs that the research literature has been documenting for 50 years. The baboon on the savannah edge is doing something that looks like nothing because it looks like standing. What it is thinking. The next part turns to the females and to what their version of this calculation produces. The weight of the male hierarchy on the animals inside it extends beyond the competitive interactions themselves into the texture of daily life in ways that are easy to miss if you are watching for dramatic events. A low-ranking male who approaches a food source where a higher-ranking male is feeding does not necessarily get attacked. He yields. The yield is the competition expressing itself in its most efficient form: no contact, no risk, no energy expenditure on either side beyond the social signal of approach and departure. These small yields happen dozens of times a day across the troop, every time a lower-ranking animal defers to a higher-ranking one at a food source, a resting spot, a water point. They are the hierarchy maintaining itself at low cost for the animals at the top and at continuous, cumulative cost for the animals at the bottom. The cortisol elevation that low-ranking males carry is the biological record of those costs, accumulated across thousands of these small interactions over years. The competition that looks dramatic in its exceptional moments is mostly a quiet, continuous pressure that the hierarchy exerts on every member of the troop, every day without requiring any exceptional event to produce its effects. The grooming network of a baboon troop maps onto the competitive hierarchy, but does not reproduce it exactly, and the gaps between the grooming network and the competitive hierarchy are themselves informative about the social strategies of the animals involved. High-ranking males receive more grooming than they give, a pattern consistent with lower-ranking animals investing in relationships with higher-ranking animals that might provide competitive protection or resource access. But within this general pattern, there are specific relationships between particular pairs of animals that involve higher mutual investment than the rank gradient alone would predict. These specific relationships are the raw material of the coalition system, and the animals who have the most of them, across the widest range of potential partners, are the animals who are best positioned to assemble a coalition when one is needed and to draw on the social capital they have accumulated when the competitive situation makes that capital's value tangible. The animals who have spent the most years at the top of the male hierarchy in the Amboselli data are not uniformly the largest or the most aggressive. They include animals of varying physical types who share one characteristic: the capacity to manage the social landscape of the troop over time in ways that maintain enough support to hold a competitive position while avoiding the injuries that end competitive careers prematurely. The baboon competitive system rewards not raw capability, but the strategic management of capability, and the animals who manage it best are the ones whose social intelligence is operating at its highest level. The brain that the competition requires is the brain that the competition has, over millions of years of evolutionary time, produced. The male baboon's large brain is the baboon's answer to the baboon's social world, and the baboon's social world is the baboon's answer to the question of how to compete for reproductive resources when you are an intelligent, long-lived primate living in a group of others like you who are running exactly the same competition in exactly the same place at exactly the same time. The female baboon is born into her rank. This is one of the most striking features of baboon social organization, and one that distinguishes the female hierarchy from the male hierarchy in a fundamental way. A male baboon's rank is something he builds over years of competitive investment, alliance formation, and physical confrontation in a troop he entered as a stranger at the bottom. It's determined primarily by her mother's position in the female hierarchy. On her behalf, she wins. If the opponent's mothers and allies intervene against her, she loses. The wins and the losses accumulate across hundreds of interactions in the first years of life, and the pattern of wins and losses establishes a learned expectation of who yields to whom that persists into adulthood. The rank is not given at birth. It is built through the repeated experience of a specific outcome in social interactions, supported by the intervention. When the mother dies before the daughter is fully adult, the daughter's rank can be on the ongoing support of the matriline. The rank is not the daughter's alone. It is the matriline's rank applied to the daughter by the presence and the action of the matriline around her. The research on what baboon females know about each other's social relationships, sometimes called third-party knowledge of relationships, the question of what social intelligence in primates actually involves. Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seyfarth's experiments at the Moremi Game Reserve, using playback of recorded vocalizations to probe what females knew about the relationships between other females in their troop, found that females responded to the vocalizations of other females in ways consistent with knowing who was affiliated with whom. When they heard the call of a female who had recently been in conflict with one of their own relatives, they responded with more vigilance than when they heard the call of a female with no recent conflict history with their relatives. They were not responding to the call alone. They were responding to the social meaning of the call, which required knowing the relationship between the caller and their own family members. This is third-party social knowledge, and its presence in baboons means that the social map a baboon female carries in her head includes not just her own relationships, but a model of the relationships between others, accurate enough to inform her own behavioral responses to those others. The aggression that high-ranking females direct at low-ranking females is one of the mechanisms that maintains the female hierarchy, and it has consequences for the low-ranking females that extend beyond the immediate interaction. Low-ranking females who are frequently threatened or attacked by higher-ranking females show elevated cortisol levels that parallel what has been documented in low-ranking males. And the health consequences of chronic subordination for females include the same suite of immunological and reproductive effects that chronic subordination produces in males. The female hierarchies with higher-ranking partners that might provide competitive protection or resource access. But the most robust and the most health-beneficial bonds are reciprocal ones, in which both partners invest in each other at rates above what the hierarchy gradient alone would predict. These reciprocal bonds are the ones that persist across the longest periods, that survive the competitive disruptions, that periodically reorganize the troop's social landscape, and that provide the most consistent buffering of the physiological stress response. The male baboon's relationship with females in the troop is not simply competitive access to estrus females. The long-term data has documented a category of male-female relationship that researchers call friendships, sustained affiliative associations between specific males and specific females that are maintained outside of the female's estrus periods, that involve grooming, proximity, and mutual support in ways that extend beyond these. The male friend of a female provides protection for her and for her infant, intervening when other males harass or threaten them, and serving as a coalition partner in defensive interactions. The female provides a social anchor in the troop for the male, a stable affiliative relationship that contributes to his social integration and that may provide access to the female's matriline social network. It is a mutually beneficial alliance that operates on a timescale of years, and that the long-term data suggests has real consequences. Female baboons are not simply passive objects of male competition. They have mating preferences that they express behaviorally when they have the option of acting on them. But the male competition for access to estrus females includes behaviors directed at the females themselves that restrict those females' ability to act on their preferences, and the documentation of these behaviors in the long-term baboon literature is one of the clearest examples of sexual coercion in a non-human primate outside of the orangutan. The female's strategies for managing both the male competition and her own mating preferences are sophisticated enough that researchers have spent years analyzing them. Estrus females use cryptic behavior, reducing the behavioral signals of their reproductive state, to manage which males attend them and when. They approach preferred males when dominant males are occupied elsewhere. They produce specific vocalizations during mating with some males, but not others, vocalizations that appear to attract additional males and potentially to confuse paternity in ways that increase the probability that multiple males in the troop will behave protectively toward the resulting infant. The mating call behavior is one of the most actively debated topics in baboon reproductive research, with conflicting evidence about whether the calls increase the probability of conception, confuse paternity to recruit protection, or serve some combination of both functions. What is not debated is that the calls are produced selectively and that their production correlates with the identity of the male involved, which means the female is making choices about when to produce them based on something she knows about the specific male she is mating with. The role of the matriarch in the female hierarchy, the oldest and highest-ranking female in the most dominant matriline, is worth examining in detail because it parallels the matriarch role in elephant and orca societies in ways that illuminate what accumulated experience does for a primate group regardless of species. The oldest high-ranking female in a baboon troop has spent decades in that troop, has social relationships with animals across every age class that date back to those animals' infancy, and carries a social knowledge of the troop's history that no younger animal can match. She knows which males have been allies and which have been rivals over multiple changes of the male hierarchy. She knows which females are reliable coalition partners and which have a history of defection. She knows which areas of the troop's range have been dangerous at which times of year and what the patterns of predator activity look like across seasonal cycles. This knowledge is not stored in any form other than the accumulated behavioral choices of an old female who has been paying attention for a long time, and it is available to the troop primarily through the behavioral choices the female continues to make, choices that the other members of the troop can observe and follow. The loss of a high-ranking female through death or emigration has effects on her matriline that are documented in the Amboseli data and that go beyond the simple question of which female moves up to fill the vacant rank position. The daughters and granddaughters of a deceased high-ranking female may experience a period of rank instability as the social infrastructure that her presence maintained. The alliances she held with other matrilines and with specific males is no longer available to support them. Some of these instabilities resolve quickly as the surviving matriline members consolidate around the new, most senior female. Others produce prolonged periods of competitive challenge and rank reshuffling that can last for months or years. The death of a high-ranking female is not just a demographic event. It is a social event, with cascading effects on the troop's competitive landscape that the long-term data is beginning to map in detail. The specific preferences that estrus females express in their mating behavior, the males they approach preferentially when they have the option, and the males they resist or attempt to avoid, have been correlated with a range of male characteristics in an attempt to understand what drives female choice in baboons when female choice is possible. Females show preferences for males who have been consistent in their affiliative behavior toward the female over time, who have demonstrated protective investment in previous infants, and who are not the highest-ranking males in the troop at the moment of mating, but who are in a strong enough competitive position to provide some protection. The preference for non-alpha males is counterintuitive, given what the rank-based reproductive success data shows, but it may reflect the female's assessment of which male is most likely to maintain a protective relationship with her and her infant over the longer term, rather than simply which male has the highest current competitive rank. The alpha male's tenure is short, and his attention is divided across all estrus females in the troop. A mid-ranking male who has invested specifically in the relationship with one female over years may be a better long-term protective investment than the alpha, even if his competitive rank is lower. The daughters of high-ranking females do not simply inherit a position in the hierarchy. They inherit the social relationships that their mothers have built, the affiliative bonds with other females, and the male friendships that their mothers maintained across years. Young females who grow up alongside their mothers' social networks have a head start in building their own networks because they are known to and have existing relationships with the females and males who matter in the troop's social landscape. The inheritance of social capital alongside the inheritance of rank is one of the mechanisms that makes the matrilineal rank transmission system more stable than it would be if rank were inherited without the relational infrastructure that makes high rank valuable. High rank without allies is more precarious than high rank with a well-developed social network. And the daughters of well-connected high-ranking females inherit both. The female baboon's daily experience of the hierarchy is different from the male's. The male hierarchy is contested regularly, with challenges and displays and coalition formation events that produce visible competitive events across the course of a day. The female hierarchy is maintained primarily through the accumulated weight of established expectations, through the behavioral deference that lower-ranking females direct at higher-ranking ones in the small continuous transactions of daily life. The hierarchy is still there. It still costs the animals at the bottom and benefits those at the top, and the costs and benefits still accumulate into the reproductive and health differences that the long-term data documents. But the day-to-day expression of it is quieter than the male version, organized around proximity and food access and the social support of allies, rather than around the dramatic displays and physical confrontations that punctuate male competitive life. The female baboon's social world is not less complex than the male's. It is differently complex, organized around longer time horizons, more durable relationships, and the management of a hierarchy that changes more slowly and that operates through mechanisms that are less immediately visible but no less consequential. The final part of this series turns to the behaviors that sit outside the ordinary operation of the baboon social system, the things that happen when the system is under unusual stress or when specific individuals push its logic to its most extreme expression. The infanticide, the redirected aggression, the experiments that revealed what the hierarchy can become when its most aggressive members are removed. These are the parts of the baboon story that complete the picture that the previous three parts have been building. And that place the animal that has been sitting on the verge watching the car go by in its full context. The infant baboon's social world is managed almost entirely by its mother in the first year of life, and the quality of that management has long-term consequences that extend well beyond the infant's direct dependence on the mother. Infants of high-ranking mothers have access to the best food sources, the safest positions within the troop formation, and the most reliable protection from harassment by other troop members. They interact more frequently with other infants of high-ranking mothers, building early social networks that reflect the matrilineal hierarchy. They observe their mothers navigating the social world from a position of relative security and effectiveness, and what they learn from those observations shapes the behavioral repertoire they bring to their own early competitive interactions. The infant whose mother is competent at managing the social world of the troop is receiving an education in social management that the infant of a low-ranking or socially isolated mother is not receiving in the same form, and the consequences of that educational difference show up in the social competence and the competitive outcomes of the adult animal. The male baboon who is being attended to as a potential friend by a female is not simply a passive recipient of female social investment. He is making his own assessment of the value of the relationship and calibrating his investment accordingly. Males who invest heavily in friendships with specific females do so at a cost to their investment in other social activities, including male coalition building, that might serve their competitive rank interests more directly. The decision to invest in a friendship is a resource allocation decision, and the males who make it appear to be making it on the basis of a specific assessment of the female's value as a social partner, which includes her rank, the size and strength of her matriline, and her history of reciprocation in the relationship. The friendship is not sentimentality in the animal. It is strategic social investment, subject to the same cost-benefit logic that governs every other social decision in a baboon's competitive life. The troop's response to the death of an infant is one of the data points on baboons' social bonds that the female chimpanzee's more solitary foraging ecology does not support in the same way. The baboon female's rich social world is partly a product of the social system that forces continuous proximity with other group members. What that proximity produces over years is the kind of detailed social knowledge and the kind of deep affiliative bonds that the research has documented as health critical. The baboon's social system is coercive at every level. It is also, in the bonds it produces, genuinely sustaining. The female baboon at the center of a high-ranking matriline, grooming a long-term partner in the afternoon shade while her latest infant explores the ground within arm's reach, is living the most stable version of baboon social life. She has what the hierarchy provides at its best: priority access to food, a well-developed social network whose members support her in competitive interactions, male friends who protect her infant, and decades of accumulated social knowledge about the troop and its members that she brings to every interaction. She is not safe in any absolute sense. The predators are real. The male hierarchy changes. The ecological conditions vary. But she has the resources, social and physical, to manage those challenges better than most of the animals around her, and the management reflects the native style was less reliant on direct aggression and more reliant on affiliative relationships. The social culture of the troop changed. Rates of aggression fell. Rates of grooming rose. The males who remained spent more time in affiliative contact with females than was typical in other baboon troops in the same area. The troop became, by the behavioral measures that researchers use to assess baboon social culture, a less violent place. Subscribe before we go any further. Drop a comment right now, telling us where you are in the world and what time it is there. Those comments mean everything to us. What Sapolsky documented in the years that followed was not simply that the troop had changed, it was that the change persisted. New males immigrated into the forest troop over the following decade, as male immigration into established troops is normal and expected in baboons' social life. These new males had been raised in other troops, in normal baboon social environments with normal baboon aggression levels. When they entered the forest troop, they encountered a social culture that was different from what they had come from, and they adopted it. The lower aggression rates and higher grooming rates were maintained not just by the original survivors, but by the immigrants who joined after the disease event. The culture had been changed by the removal of its most aggressive practitioners, and the change was transmitted to animals who had never experienced the original culture. The forest troop case is the most compelling natural experiment in the baboon literature on whether the level of violence in a baboon social system is fixed by the biology of the species or whether it is a product of the specific social culture of the specific troop, a culture that can change when the conditions that maintain it are altered. The answer the data provided was clear. The culture can change. It can persist after it changes, and it can be transmitted to new members who then maintain it. The biology sets the range of what is possible. The culture determines where within that range the specific troop sits. The logical outcomes in baboons has been mapped in enough detail to tell a coherent biological story. The stress response in mammals involves the release of cortisol from the adrenal glands in response to signals from the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, a cascade called the HPA axis. In animals under chronic stress, this cascade is activated at higher baseline rates and produces higher resting cortisol levels. Chronically elevated cortisol has downstream effects on the immune system, on the cardiovascular system, on the reproductive hormones, and on the brain itself, including effects on the hippocampus that impair spatial memory and increase anxiety. The low-ranking baboon is living with a chronically activated stress response that is remodeling its biology in ways that accumulate across years. The social system is not just making low-ranking animals unhappy insofar as they experience something that deserves that word. It is changing their bodies in ways that shorten their lives and reduce their reproductive success. The question of what the baboon's experience of its own social world is like, whether there is something it is like to be a low-ranking baboon enduring the chronic stress of its position, is one that the science cannot answer directly, and that philosophy handles with difficulty. What the behavioral and hormonal data provides is not access to the baboon's subjective experience, but a detailed picture of what chronic stress does to the baboon's body and behavior that is consistent with, though not proof of, an aversive experience. The baboon that suppresses its behavior in the presence of dominant animals, that carries elevated cortisol across years, that shows immune suppression and shortened lifespan, is an animal whose biology is responding to its social environment in the way that mammalian biology responds to adverse conditions. Whether that response involves anything like what we would call suffering is a question the data allows but does not require. What it does require is that we take seriously the biological reality of what chronic social subordination produces, regardless of how we answer the experiential question. The long-term data from Amboselli on the relationship between an individual baboon's social network quality and its health outcomes has been published in papers whose conclusions have been compared by some researchers to findings from human epidemiology on the social determinants of health. The finding that individuals with stronger social bonds live longer, recover faster from illness and injury, and have higher reproductive success than individuals with weaker social bonds, holding other variables constant, parallels the finding in human populations that social isolation is a significant predictor of mortality, comparable in effect size to smoking. The comparison is not precise, and the causal mechanisms are different in important details, but the structural parallel that social connection is a biological resource and social isolation is a biological risk across two species as different as baboons and humans points towards something real about the biology of social mammals that the long-term primate data is particularly well positioned to illuminate. The infanticide that occurs in baboon troops is one of the behaviors that the forest troop case is sometimes taken to illuminate. Though the connection is indirect, when new males immigrate into a troop, or when the male hierarchy undergoes rapid reorganization, the risk of infanticide rises because the conditions that produce infanticide, the presence of males who are not the fathers of current nursing infants, are more prevalent during periods of social instability. The logic is the same as in gorillas, in chimpanzees, and in many other mammalian species where infanticide has been documented. A male who kills a nursing infant that is not his own brings the infant's mother back into reproductive cycling faster than if the infant had survived, allowing the infanticidal male to sire his own offspring sooner. The documentation of infanticide in baboons across multiple field sites has been thorough enough to establish its occurrence as a regular, if not daily, feature of baboon social life. It is more likely during periods of male hierarchy instability, during the immigration of new males, and in troops with high male turnover rates. The females whose infants are at risk have developed behavioral responses to this risk that the research has documented in detail, staying close to males who are likely to be the infant's father or who have established a protective friendship with the female, moving toward the center of the troop formation when unfamiliar males are present, and producing alarm calls when males whose behavior suggests aggressive intent approach the infant. These responses are not always effective. The long-term infant mortality data from Amboseli includes a component attributable to male aggression that the female's defensive behaviors reduce but do not eliminate. The specific behavioral sequence that precedes a baboon infanticide, when it has been observed closely enough to document, reveals the deliberate quality of the behavior in a way that distinguishes it from the accidental injuries that also contribute to infant mortality. A male who is about to commit infanticide approaches the infant's mother and the infant with a specific behavioral pattern that experienced field researchers learn to recognize as different from the same male's approach in non-aggressive contexts. He watches, he positions himself. He waits for a moment when the mother's attention is divided or when the infant is at the maximum distance from them. Required years of continuous options. The low-ranking animals have what remains. The females at the center of their matrilines are in proximity to the animals they have groomed and been groomed by for decades. The males are distributed according to their current competitive positions that will shift in the weeks and months ahead as alliances are tested and new challenges are attempted. The troop is doing what baboon troops do at night, which is to be together in a dangerous world, in a formation that the hierarchy organized and that the hierarchy will reorganize in the morning. The animal that looked like a problem on the verge of the road is the same animal sleeping in that tree, carrying in its body the record of every competitive interaction it has survived and every social investment it has made, running even in its sleep the slow accounting of a social life that never fully pauses. It is one of the most cognitively sophisticated, socially complex and ecologically successful animals on Earth. It is also one of the most thoroughly studied, and what the study has produced is a picture of primate social life in its full reality, with the violence and the tenderness and the strategic intelligence and the chronic suffering all present at once, inseparable from each other, all part of the same animal, all part of what primates are. Sleep well. The relationship between the baboon social system's violence and the baboon's intelligence is one that the 4 parts of this series have been circling around without stating directly. And the final part is the right place to state it. The baboon is violent in the ways that the previous 3 parts described, not despite its intelligence, but partly because of it. The coalition challenge requires the ability to assess the competitive landscape, identify the optimal moment for a challenge, and coordinate with a partner whose cooperation has been secured through prior investment. The redirected aggression requires the ability to identify a target that is low enough in rank to be safely attacked after a frustrating encounter with a rival. The infanticide requires the ability to identify the infant's probable non-paternity and to create or exploit an opportunity to kill it when the mother's protective capabilities are minimized. None of these behaviors is simple or reflexive. They are the output of a cognitive system sophisticated enough to plan, calculate, and execute, applied to the competitive problems of a social life that is itself one of the most cognitively demanding environments any primate inhabits. The intelligence and the violence are not separate features. They are the same feature expressed in the 2 most consequential domains of baboon life, the social and the competitive. The baboon that Sapolsky has written about most personally, across the books he produced alongside his scientific papers, is not an abstraction. He knew specific animals across decades of field work. He watched them compete and groom and age and die. He watched what the hierarchy did to them over time, in their bodies and in their behavior. The scientific record he produced is one of the most important in 20th century primatology. But the experience of producing it, of being present in the Masai Mara across 30 years of specific animals, living specific lives in a specific social system, produced something alongside the scientific record that informed how he wrote about what he found. The baboon is not just a study subject in the Sapolsky literature, it is a presence, with an individuality and a social life that the decades of observation made vivid enough to carry weight beyond the hormone levels and the dominance ranks. The science and the observation of specific lives are not the same thing, and both are present in the best baboon research in ways that make the field genuinely unusual in the animal sciences. The conservation status of baboons is, for once in a series about primates, not primarily a story of imminent threat. Most baboon species are not endangered, and some populations are expanding as they adapt to human-modified landscapes. The Hamadryas baboon is the one species with a population that is considered vulnerable, confined to a relatively small range in the Horn of Africa that is under ecological pressure from human land use change. The other 4 species, while declining in specific areas due to habitat loss and human-wildlife conflict, are not facing the existential pressures that the great apes face. The baboon's adaptability and its ecological flexibility have made it one of the primates most capable of persisting alongside human development. Even as the specific quality of that persistence, the raids on farms, the conflicts with agricultural communities, the management challenges for wildlife agencies, is not straightforwardly positive for either the baboons or the humans sharing their landscape. The baboon's success is real. So is the complicated reality of what that success produces at the interface between baboon-ranging behavior and human land use. The troop that emerges from the forest troop case as a thought experiment, the baboon troop that has found its way to a lower aggression social equilibrium, is not a utopia. The hierarchy is still present. The rank differences still translate into differential access to resources and into differential health outcomes. The males still compete for access to estrus females. The females still inherit the rank of their mothers and live under the competitive pressure that the female hierarchy imposes. The lower aggression culture did not eliminate these features. It modulated the intensity with which they were expressed, reducing the rates of the most damaging forms of aggression, particularly the redirected aggression that exported stress from the top of the hierarchy to the bottom. A less aggressive baboon troop is still a baboon troop. What the forest troop case demonstrates is not that baboon social life can be transformed into something benign. It is that within the range of variation that baboon biology allows, the specific position a given troop occupies on that range is not fixed, and that the social culture of the troop, shaped by the behavior of the animals in it, is one of the factors that determines where within the range the troop sits. The Amboseli Baboon Project, which has been running continuously since 1971, will have been running for more than 60 years by the time any reader of this series encounters it. 60 years is long enough to track individual animals across their entire lives, to watch the offspring of those animals grow into adults, to observe the offspring of those offspring begin their own social careers, to document the transmission of rank and social behavior across 3 or 4 generations of identified individuals. No other study of wild mammals has produced a data set of this depth and duration for a species of this social complexity. What that data set has produced and continues to produce is not just facts about baboons. It is a demonstration of what it is possible to know about an animal if you are patient enough, and present enough and consistent enough to be there for what the animal's life actually contains. The baboon repays that patience with a social world of extraordinary depth, running continuously in the African landscape, available to anyone willing to stay long enough to see it. The series that began with who the baboon is ends here, with what the baboon reveals. It reveals that intelligence and social complexity are not separable from the competitive dynamics that produced them, that the brain large enough to track 100 individual social network is the same brain that uses that network to organize competitive strategies that produce chronic suffering in the animals on the losing end. It reveals that the culture of a social group is not fixed by the biology of the species, but shaped by the specific individuals in the group and the behaviors they model, and that changing the culture is possible when the conditions that maintain it change. It reveals that what social bonds do for the health and the longevity and the reproductive success of primates is not incidental to social life, but central to it, a biological resource as real and as consequential as the physical resources that the hierarchy controls access to. And it reveals that studying one animal carefully enough and long enough produces not just knowledge about that animal, but knowledge about social life itself, in forms that extend beyond the boundaries of the species studied, and that illuminate something about the nature of primate sociality that no shorter study and no less careful observation could have reached. The baboon in the sleeping tree tonight does not know it is being observed. It does not know it is the subject of a 50-year scientific project or the protagonist of a series that has spent 4 parts on its social world. It is doing what it does every night in that tree, which is to be a baboon. In the specific troop it is in the specific position in the hierarchy it occupies, with the specific social relationships it has built across the years of its life. Tomorrow it will descend and join the troop's daily movement through the landscape and continue running the social calculation that its life requires. The hierarchy will be what it was. The alliances will be what they are. The competition will continue, and the costs will be paid and the benefits will be distributed, and the social world of the troop will go on producing the outcomes that the baboon's biology and the baboon's culture combine to determine. The baboon does not need to know any of this. It is living it, and what it is living, for all its cost and all its complexity, is one of the most sophisticated and most thoroughly understood social lives in the natural world. Sleep well. What the full series on the baboon has done, across the introduction of the animal, the male hierarchy, the female social world, and the extremes of the system, is to build a portrait of a primate social life that is complete in a way that few single-species studies achieve. Not complete in the sense of exhausting what there is to know, the Amboseli project alone continues to produce new findings after more than 50 years of continuous observation. Complete in the sense of honest, of including the violence and the tenderness without privileging either, of documenting the costs and the benefits without reducing the animal to either its worst behaviors or its most appealing ones. The baboon is the animal that rewards this kind of honesty more than most, because its social world is complicated enough that simplifying it in either direction, toward the monster or toward the gentle social creature, misses what is actually there. What is actually there is an animal running a social system of genuine sophistication at genuine cost, producing genuine outcomes for its members, across a landscape that has been changing around it for as long as it has been there to inhabit. That is the baboon. That is what 4 parts have been for.